Hi, my name is Takota Coen. We're here on Coen Farm, and in this video we're going to be talking about swales versus keyline. When it comes to the swales versus keyline question, when we were asking ourselves which do we choose on our farm about 8 years ago, we decided to go with the keyline system first. And after spending thousands of dollars and months of our life and not seeing the benefits that we wanted to see, we decided to switch over to the swales option, which I'll explain about later. Fast forward through those years, and every year on our farm we're capturing more than 40 years worth of water every spring runoff event. We use about 250,000 gallons of water every year on our farm for our livestock use, our domestic use, and for our irrigation. And we're harvesting more than 10 million gallons of water throughout our 3 kilometers of swales, our several dams, dugouts, ponds, flood irrigation systems. And as a result of all that water that we're infiltrating into our ground, we're healing our water cycle. Our pastures are increasing in production. We're able to grow trees now without any drip irrigation or supplemental irrigation or watering. And we're actually recharging our underground aquifers. So some of our neighbors at the nearby lake lots here have said at a recent tour that they've noticed the quality and quantity of their wells has increased in the last few years, strangely, and until they saw what we were doing here, they didn't know what was going on. So you absolutely can heal your water cycle, and depending on where you live in the world, you might be able to do that with either swales or keyline. And in this video we're going to be talking about how you can make that decision for your own property. On one hand, we have swales, and swales are essentially wetlands on contour. They're a ditch that the bottom of the trench is the same elevation the entire way along. So as water flows downslope and it enters into that ditch, it's forced to fill up the entire ditch before it fills over. On the other hand, we have keyline. Keyline and particularly keyline subsoiling is a system where you're ripping trenches, small trenches into the soil to try to infiltrate rainfall into those trenches as close to where they fell as possible. So one of the easiest ways to think about the differences in these systems is that keyline is a really great system for the infiltration of non-point source water flows, so things like rain that falls evenly over the entire landscape and then is concentrated by the geography. Basically from the ridges, the rain falls down into the valleys. Keyline makes great sense in where you're having water runoff from that kind of a situation, because those trenches are going to help get that water into the soil as close to where it fell as possible. Now, swales, on the other hand, are better for non-point source waters. Swales, on the other hand, are much better for point source water flows. So this is where you have water that's already been concentrated from off your property. So when it enters your property, it's already in a stream, and smaller water harvesting structures won't work, and so you need something that's larger that can grab that point source water flow and spread it out across the landscape. I just gotta blow my nose here. Just give me a sec. God damn, hay fever.
What, from all the pollen?
I've had bad allergies ever since I was a kid.
Oh, really? Eh?
It was actually, at one point, I knew I couldn't be a farmer because my hay fever was so bad.
Oh, wow.
But it's way better than it used to be.
Crazy.
So, I don't know if that was too, is that too jargony?
No, not really. That's straight ahead in a way. But maybe now explain.
I can definitely go into more detail of like the point source, non-point source, and why, like tell our story of how we actually we did subsoiling and stuff. So and as a broad rule, actually coming back up a little further, subsoiling in a keyline pattern. Actually, no, because like keyline isn't. Keyline was a design system that originated in Australia and was devised by a man named P.A. Yeomans. And the genius of this design system was the observation that humid landscapes have repeating patterns in the geography, and that if you have a series of valleys in a landscape, they all tend to be a little bit lower than the valley before it. So you've got, you think about a watershed where you've got little creeks that go into bigger creeks, that go into rivers, that go into bigger rivers, until you eventually end up at the. So all of those valleys that go from small to big, they're part of a larger ridgeline system that goes from big to small, and and so the arrangement of those valleys across the landscape follows repeating patterns that if you build dams and canals that connect those dams up together, they're actually not on contour. They're slightly off contour. They're in a falling pattern across the landscape. That's a general rule. It doesn't always work, but that's the general rule of thumb. And so the genius of Yeomans was that you could look at a topographical map and figure out where the best location in a landscape was to build a dam if you wanted to do flood irrigation for pastures, and then and then you could build series of dams that were all parallel, and it was a great system that worked for the kind of partnering the curvy nature of natural systems with the tendency for farming to need to be in straight lines. All of our fences are in straight lines. All of our equipment is fixed width. Our hay binds, our cultivators, our seeders, and so it works really well between merging the natural with the man-made. Now, one of the core practices with the Keyline system is the use of subsoiling, which is using a plow, either a chisel plow or now modern subsoilers, to go along and follow these lines in the landscape that are slowly falling down slope as they connect these different dams up. Those lines are all parallel, and so now you can go along with some kind of a subsoiler, and just as you're ripping in the soil, those rip lines kind of invert the pattern that water tends to do, which is where water runs from the ridges down into the valleys. Whereas once you figure out what your key line is, as you're ripping those trenches in the soil, they actually take water from the valleys back up to the ridges. So it actually inverts the natural flow of water, which is fantastic when you're dealing with non-point source water flow. So like the rain is falling evenly across the whole landscape, being concentrated from the ridges to the valleys. This Keyline system, where those plows come in, they pick up that water and they send it back out to the ridges. So if you have a damaged water cycle from compaction or a lack of soil carbon, the subsoiling is a fantastic way to address those weak links. Of course, that deals with the two of the ingredients of agriculture, the other two being living organisms and sunlight, as the four ingredients you need to produce any agricultural product on the planet. So if you've got now where the system doesn't make a lot of sense is if you're in a situation where you don't have excess rainfall that your soils can't infiltrate. So if you are wondering whether or not you should do Keyline subsoiling on your property, you need to ask yourself two questions. The first question is, do I have compaction? Or is my soil lacking oxygen? And if the answer is no, and you can do that by taking penetrometers and are looking for different indicator species in the grasses to see if you have plants that are trying to break up a hard pan, dig down into the soil, try to find evidence of soil compaction. If you don't have soil compaction, which is limiting oxygen to be able to get into your soil, then Keyline might not make sense for you. Unless you have another problem, which is that the water rainfall rate is exceeding your soil's ability to infiltrate it. So unless you have an oxygen problem or a water problem specifically from rainfall, subsoiling doesn't make any sense. Subsoiling can be very expensive. It uses a lot of fossil fuels. You have to do it multiple times, and so the actual pattern for subsoiling was if you have a landscape, which actually I'll start that over. So the broad pattern for putting Keyline subsoiling to work is you figure out where those parallel lines in the landscape are that allow you to run these deep tillage patterns through to create channels for water to flow from the valleys back up to the ridges. And then, and once you do that, that allows the water to enter into the soil so that you can grow more grass. And once the grass starts to grow, you would come through and you would graze that grass off, which pulls carbon into the soil as the roots die off and as the animals are trampling the excess vegetation into the soil. And then you'd come back again and you'd rip the soil, but a little bit deeper this time, which would allow the plant roots to go a little bit deeper into the soil. And with this practice, there's been some evidence that you can basically turn subsoils or clays or sands into topsoil, because you're allowing oxygen and water to enter into the soil where they couldn't before. And then you're using livestock in a rotational grazing pattern to fast track ecological succession, with the end goal being that your soils are healthy enough that you don't need a subsoil anymore, because the water precipitation rates aren't exceeding your soil infiltration rates anymore. And it's a fantastic system if you have poor soils that are either lacking oxygen, they're compacted, or they don't have they're low in carbon and they're not able to pull water into them. Now, if you don't have those problems, it's a giant waste of money and time, and it can be very expensive. These subsoiling plows can be tens of thousands of dollars, and they require a decent amount of horsepower to run, and you have to do them multiple times per year to gain the best effects, and it's a multi-year process. So it's you might be subsoiling for 4 or 5 years to see some of the benefits several times a year. There's a magazine in the US called On Pasture, and they actually did variety trials in Vermont with a bunch of different farmers, where they did experimentations over a couple years where they did subsoiling in different pastures, and they measured different soil health indicators to see whether or not the subsoiling was actually helping to improve the soil. And what they found was that there actually wasn't a lot of benefit. And I think the reason why in Vermont they didn't see the benefits like some of the practitioners that we're seeing in Australia and some drier climates, was because in Vermont you've got really healthy soils that are high in carbon, and rainfall typically doesn't exceed infiltration rates of the soil. So they didn't see a lot of benefits, whereas guys in Australia and New Mexico, where they've got soil compaction and excess water that can't go into the soil, if you subsoil there, you see huge benefits. And so that deals with the Keyline system. Now, when it comes to swales make really good sense when you've got frozen soils, or a point source water flow that's coming from offside your property that those small rips wouldn't be large enough to help spread the water out across the landscape. And so if you live in a situation, in any of those two situations where your soils are frozen, and or you have a point source water flow that you can't get into the soil in any other way, swales might make sense for you. And I want to illustrate this now with just a really simple example here, actually in one of our swales in the property that we're just flood irrigating right now. So when I'm talking about point source water flow, what I'm talking about is I want you to imagine that my property boundary exists right here. I've got this little. So when we're talking about point source water flows, I want you to imagine that my property exists right here. It's this little block, and for whatever reason, I've got water that comes in and flows through that one particular valley. So this is a point source water flow. And now, no matter how many little rips I make in the soil there, it's not going to be able to infiltrate that water, because it's coming in way too fast for even those rips to get into the soil. Now, so in a situation like that, you need a really large, some kind of a swale, or some kind of a dam or wetland or something, that you can actually build up so that when the water comes in, it's large enough that it can divert those point source water flows and slow it down enough to the point where it can slowly fill in and infiltrate down. Now, so this is a point source water flow. When you've got non-point source water flows, which means you've got another area of land the same size, but this time you're dealing with something like rainfall, where you've got actually little bits of just droplets of water that are falling evenly across the whole landscape. But it's actually there's actually too much water to be infiltrated just from the rainfall, and so you can see it starts to concentrate into the valleys further down the slope and cause problems. And so but you have management control over the uplands where the water is being concentrated by the valley from non-point source into point source. And so that's where coming in and making really small, rips in the soil with a subsoiling plow, like a Keyline plow or something like that. Now, when you come back and you have that non-point source water flow falling down, it's able to go into those rip lines and hopefully infiltrate in a little better. And then afterwards you would come by, now that the water is in the soil, it can grow grass, which means you can bring livestock in to graze the grass, which means you're going to build the carbon, and eventually get to the point where you don't need a subsoil anymore. But this is the main difference, is if you take that same landscape and you are doing, a point source water flow, it doesn't do any good. And so this is what we found on our farm is we came at this from the technique perspective, which was we had symptoms, which was our pastures were declining in production. And I watched a couple videos on YouTube, and one of the symptoms that Keyline was, the silver bullet of Keyline subsoiling was promised to fix, was poor pasture production. And so without doing any further diagnosis, my dad and I actually went out and bought an agri-plow, which is a version of a subsoiler plow that's made in Australia. I think it was $7,000 or $8,000. And we just started subsoiling all of our fields. And we were using a 150 horse tractor, and we could barely pull, it was an 8-shank unit, we could barely pull 3 or 4 shanks, only going 8 or 12 inches into the ground. Now this unit had coulters and everything on it. I don't know if I've seen pictures of the yeoman's plows where they're pulling them with 60 horse tractors going down 2 feet. I don't know what kind of soil conditions, or maybe the plows are made better, but we were literally picking the front end of our tractor off the ground and almost flipping it, 150 horse tractor, with only pulling half the shanks at half the depth that we wanted to go. And and we did variety trials across the farm. We found no increase in pasture production, and the reason for that is because we didn't have our pastures never had runoff from rainfall, and we didn't have a compaction issue. We've got tons of gophers, and if you think about it, if you live in a climate where your grounds freeze solid, 4 to 7 feet down in the ground, what does frost do to pavement and concrete? It shatters it. It breaks it up. So we did not have a compaction problem, and so we wasted thousands and thousands of dollars and months of our life trying to solve a problem, coming at it from a technique approach. Then, as we started to do more research and more diagnosis and playing around with other systems, we started experimenting with swales as an alternative approach to our particular context, which is we have point source water flows that originate from snow melt. So precipitation, 50% of our precipitation comes from snow, and that precipitation is already concentrated by the wind against things like fences, shelter belt tree rows, or even standing grass can capture snow. And if a snowdrift is hard enough that you can walk on it, it's up to 50% water. And so we had these point source water flows across our property in the forms of snowdrift that when the spring melts came, they would melt in a short period of time, and for a few hours every evening, you'd get these pulsing of point source water flows. The water was already concentrated. It wasn't like rainfall, and the other observation we made was, well, we were making these subsoiling rips into the ground, a foot deep, but our frosts were going 4 to 6 feet into the ground, 4 to 7 feet into the ground, and so even if they did work to infiltrate water, it wouldn't have made a difference because the ground was a sheet of glass. So in our particular context, the more we looked at it, subsoiling made little to no sense for any reason, but swales made a lot of sense because it allowed us to take this huge concentration of water and slow it down, spread it out, and sink into the ground slow enough that the water could infiltrate in. And so we started experimenting with that. We built a couple small swales by hand, and we did bigger ones. And what we actually found was some really interesting things. One of them is that the water in this swale actually helps to pull frost out of the ground. So I want you to imagine, you forgot that your friends were coming over for supper, and you forgot to pull the roast or the steaks out of the freezer, and you need to get them in the oven quickly as possible, and you need to thaw them out really fast. So what do? You run a sink full of water and you throw them in the sink. It doesn't have to be hot water, even cold water, because the high heat capacity of water helps to pull the heat out and unthaw your steaks. Well, the same thing started to happen with this massive amount of water we were holding in the sink of the basin of the swale. And one day when I was out planting trees in the springtime with a penetrometer, I was doing willow cuttings. I came along and I was planting them right at the base of the swale. And for whatever reason, I walked, I had to go to the bathroom. And so I walked 10 feet away from the swale, and I went to go stuff my penetrometer in the ground while I unzipped my pants to go to the bathroom. And I couldn't get it in the ground because it was frozen solid. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so after I took a leak, I took my penetrometer and I started poking it in the ground. And what I found was, as I got closer to the swale, the compaction or the frost disappeared. And then I could even go above the swale and there was no compaction. And as I went further and further away, the compaction got more and more and more. And eventually, about 15, 20 feet above the swale and 15, 20 feet below the swale, there was no frost. But as soon as I got outside of that, there was frost. And so because our water cycle is so damaged in that we've got all the snow is blowing off of our landscape because our pastures and hay fields and cropland are being overgrazed, or the trees have been cut down. The frost that was once holding, keeping the ground insulated so the frost wouldn't go as deep so that water could actually infiltrate right where the snow fell. Now it's all being blown up so the ground freezes deep down into the ground. And now you've got frozen ground and point source water flows, and when those release, they can cause erosion, and there's just no way to get into the ground, which is, water is one of the key ingredients you need to grow any agricultural product. So the only way to turn that around, now that we've stripped all the wetlands out and cut down all the trees, is in order to grow the trees and the grass to capture the snow, you need the water. And so you can't just throw seeds in the ground and get plants to grow without it. So what we could do is pay a bit of money to build a swale, plant the water first, so that we could then plant the trees and turn our broken water cycle around. When you're dealing with the question of, do I build swales or do I keyline, remember the key questions you need to ask yourself is, first, is water a weak link? And if so, how is it a weak link? Is it point source or non-point source water? And do you have some kind of soil compaction or an oxygen problem? If you have compaction in your soils and you have a non-point source water flow that's running off, like rainfall that's running off your soils, subsoiling might make sense for you. If, on the other hand, you don't have soil compaction, you've got frozen ground or some kind of a point source water flow that's coming from off your property that you don't have any other way of slowing and spreading and sinking out across the property, swales might make sense for you.